Good evening. I'm Mark Updegrove, director of the LBJ Library, and I want to welcome you back for what promises to be another great season of programming at the LBJ Library. So welcome back, friends. And if you are not friends, we would be delighted to have you join our group, and there's literature outside of the auditorium for you to join the program. But we have some wonderful things in store for you this season, and we're already on to planning next season. President Johnson would have loved tonight's program. One of his favorite biblical passages was, "Come, let us reason together." And it was that guiding principle that made him the leading legislator of his time. It doesn't take a political scientist to see that there isn't a great deal of reason or togetherness in Washington, D.C. today. But in keeping with LBJ's wishes, the library that bears his name will always be a place where any reasonable view in the ideological spectrum will be welcome and encouraged. Ideological differences need not translate into acrimony and division. So tonight, LBJ would be pleased that Margaret Hoover is our guest, not only because she is the great-granddaughter of his friend, the 31st President of the United States, Republican Herbert Hoover, but also because of her constructive vision for what the Republican Party can be to strengthen our nation. Margaret shares that vision in her recent book, American Individualism: How a New Generation of Conservatives Can Save the Republican Party. A Fox News contributor regularly appearing with Bill O'Reilly, Margaret worked in the George W. Bush White House, on 2 presidential campaigns, and on Capitol Hill as a congressional aide. She currently serves as on the advisory council of the American Foundation for Equal Rights and GOP Proud, as well as on the board of the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Association. Tonight, Margaret will speak to us on American individualism. Then we'll be joined in conversation with LBJ Foundation President Elizabeth Christian. Elizabeth, in her day job, is the president of Elizabeth Christian PR, one of the most respected PR firms in Texas. She is also the daughter of George Christian, who served President Johnson as press secretary and as an indispensable advisor during the latter part of his administration. But first, please welcome our very special guest, Margaret Hoover.
Thank you, Mark, for that introduction. And I'd also like to thank Larry Temple and Elizabeth Christian and all of you for being here tonight and giving me the opportunity to tell you a little bit about myself and about my new book. It's especially exciting to be here because in the last year, I've had an opportunity to become acquainted with both Linda Johnson Robb and Lucy Baines Johnson. Linda was kind enough to come up to West Branch, Iowa, which is the home of the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum, just 3.5 weeks ago, actually, for our annual celebration called Hoover Fest, where she delivered a lovely keynote speech at the gravesite of my great-grandfather. Lucy and I also participated in a very fun event, which you can find on C-SPAN 3, with Susan Ford Bales and Clifton Truman Daniel at the Little White House in Key West that is part of the Truman Complex. So they're lovely people, and Mark, you all are very lucky to have such vibrant first daughters as part of your foundation organization. My favorite story, though, which I absolutely have to start telling out, and you all will appreciate this if you know President Johnson, which you all do. When he was beginning his presidential library, he decided that in order to figure out really what he wanted to do, he needed to go around and visit the other presidential libraries at the time. And so he went to the Hoover Library, the Truman Library, the FDR Library. And he came back after visiting the Hoover Library and sat his staff down. And I know this on firsthand account because 2 of the staffers who were there have long ties to the Hoover complex. And he said, "You know what I learned Herbert Hoover was an incredible human being, an amazing president, an extraordinary life he led. You know, I learned more about Herbert Hoover and the story of his presidency and the story of his life than I had ever seen in my entire life. And the way his presidential library staff put together that story of his life was just brilliant. And he paused, and he looked them all in the eye, and he said, "And that's what I want you to do for me at the Johnson Presidential Library." My book is called American Individualism. The subtitle is How a New Generation of Conservatives Can Save the Republican Party. Now, when I'm speaking to a group of Republicans, I commonly have to explain what needs to be saved, because Republicans are very defensive. We're, doing pretty well right now in Washington, having succeeded in changing the discourse about spending. But given that I'm here talking to the Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Library Foundation crowd, I'm assuming that I'm speaking to some strong, lifelong Democrats. And my sense is that you're probably nodding, thank goodness there's somebody who's going to save the Republican Party. You may think, I've got a lot of work to do. But what I'd like to do is start off by framing this with something Linda Johnson-Robb told me, which is, and I couldn't agree with her more, which is that if you're like Linda or like me, and you've been raised in a presidential family with a partisan tradition, you have respect for a strong opposition party, because the health of the American political system really depends on two strong parties competing for the votes of the electorate, so that even if you are a good Democrat and you're here listening to me tonight, you can hopefully empathize with the fact that I'm a young Republican with the desire to make my party more robust for the sake of the country, and that two robust parties make the country stronger and better. My book is about the Millennial generation. Now, they're called the Millennial generation because they're first generation to come of age in the new millennium. They were born at the beginning of the Reagan era through the end of the Clinton presidency. These are the 30 and unders, the young folks, the people who drove to the polls and flooded the polls, really, for Barack Obama's election. This generation is the largest generation in American history. Conservative estimates suggest that there are 80 million of them total. 50 million of them were eligible to vote in 2008, and more than half of them turned out to the polls. There are 17 million more of them than baby boomers. There are 27 million more of them than Generation X. And if you've noticed, they are not identifying with the Republican Party. When you look at raw votes cast in the 2008 election, Barack Obama won the election by 10 million raw votes. But in the 30 and under cohort, he won by 8 million raw votes. This generation is voting, they voted 66% for Barack Obama, 32% for John McCain. If they turn out in the same numbers that they did in 2008, they are expected to be 24% of the electorate. 65 million of them will be eligible to vote in 2012. The reason this is urgent for the Republican Party, and if you're a Democrat, you may be jumping with joy with what I'm about to tell you. This is urgent because partisan identity in new generations solidifies after 3 presidential election cycles. This generation broke hard for John Kerry in 2004. They decisively voted for Barack Obama in 2008. The GOP basically has 15 months to reach out and connect and make inroads with this next generation, or they're at risk of losing them for the rest of their lives. The title of my book, American Individualism, is a reference to my great-grandfather, Herbert Hoover, who wrote a book entitled American Individualism in 1922. And as I was thinking about how to connect the Republican Party to the next generation, I realized that Herbert Hoover's life and values actually mirrors the values of the millennial generation in really surprising ways. And that in his book, American Individualism, he lays out a template that is Republican-rooted, but thoroughly relevant to this next generation in ways that I'll tell you about. And that I believe that in this, there's a framework that the Republican Party can use to connect to this new rising generation in American history. Now, for the Democrats here, I hope you'll forgive me. As you can imagine, I've been a proud and lifelong Republican. As a descendant of Herbert Hoover, the 31st president, since my earliest days, I've been a student of Herbert Hoover, of his life, of his philosophy, and I grew up in the tradition, going to his presidential library, and also his proudest legacy, the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And my upbringing was informed by his wit and his wisdom and stories of his life. But also, being related to Herbert Hoover has helped me learn to think independently. Because as you can imagine, being related to the most vilified president in 20th century, you have to develop a thick skin. I mean, this is a man who you all know is dragged out every presidential election cycle as the whipping boy for economic hard times. And I remember very distinctly my 8th grade history class when I brought my textbook home and there it said, Herbert Hoover caused the Great Depression. My dad sat me down and sort of told me his perspective. And from then on, I really made a concerted effort to go to the historical record myself, to think independently about history, and to shun the conventional political narratives that develop in our history. And that's one of the things that I think are so relevant about presidential libraries. I think presidential libraries are the place where you go to get the president's side of the story. The historical narrative will develop as it will. It will be informed by the president, by his scholars, by his biographers. But presidential libraries are so important because it was in those years that I started going to the Hoover Library and really seeing this entirely different side of Herbert Hoover, of his life, of his presidency. And I have to tell you, the best gift I got from being related to Herbert Hoover was the ability to learn to think independently and decipher history on my own terms by going to the historical record and not just listening to what the history books said. For the record, Herbert Hoover is a man who his contemporaries called the great humanitarian. This is a man who really rose to world prominence by feeding 8 million Belgians during World War I who were blockaded thanks to the German invasion. This is a man who, during the Bolshevik Revolution, he despised communism, despised Lenin, but personally took it upon himself to make sure that the Russian people didn't starve, organized throughout the countryside in Russia 2,900 food kitchens, which fed 11 million Russians per day, because he simply believed that America shouldn't let even its enemies starve. Also, a man that his contemporaries called the master of emergencies. You know, many people forget that in 1927, the largest natural disaster ever to hit American shores came to us in the form of the Mississippi River flood, which can only really be equated in modern days as the modern day Katrina. And it was because of his handling of that crisis. He was Commerce Secretary at the time. He was catapulted into as the obvious choice for the presidency in 1928. And we should be reminded, Herbert Hoover had never held elected office before he was elected to the presidency. He's the only civilian ever to be elected to the presidency without ever holding a prior elected office. I mean, that says that there is something extraordinarily remarkable about this individual that simply is missing from the historical record that just blames him for the Great Depression. So as you can tell, I think that there is so much that Americans can learn from Herbert Hoover and the Republican Party can learn from Herbert Hoover. And I think history hasn't still given him a fair hearing. I think he was unjustly maligned for the politics of the New Deal and the Great Depression. And I think a reevaluation of his legacy is coming due. In fact, I think the time is ripe now. But despite what you can tell is my obvious pride in the legacy of my great-grandfather, I actually, in my own life, decided to steer away from participating in any form of politics as I was growing up. I never interned for a local representative. I didn't go to Washington. I didn't even study political science or major in political science in college. Instead, I studied Spanish language literature and Mandarin Chinese. I was actually inspired by the path that my great-grandfather and great-grandmother took in their early lives. They lived abroad for about 20 years. And my great-grandmother studied Chinese, so I studied abroad in Bolivia and Mexico and China. And as soon as I graduated from university, I got my first job in, where else? Taipei, Taiwan. I got a job working for a Taiwanese law firm in Taipei and would be studying Mandarin Chinese at night while I was working as an editor and a policy assistant in the daytime. But my first day there was 9/11. And 9/11 changed things for everybody. But for me, that day was the day I decided I wanted to come back, I wanted to be in the United States, and I wanted to participate in the functioning of our democracy. I'd always, because of my grandparents, and my family legacy, had a deep appreciation for our government, our form of governance, the American political system, but it was that made me, staying up late at night, as everybody did on television, but for me, because we were 12 hours later, I would work in the day, come home, watch CNN all night. For the record, I watched CNN because there was no Fox News in Taipei at the time. And seeing George Bush pull the country together in an incredible display of unity, and Rudy Giuliani as well, this really inspired me. And so after a year in Taiwan, I returned to the United States. I volunteered on a Senate campaign in my home state of Colorado. And then I made my way to Washington. I landed a job on Capitol Hill working for a freshman member of Congress. I actually was able to use my Spanish because he was from Miami and needed a Spanish speaker in his Washington office. So the language pays off if you're thinking about studying languages. And then had an opportunity to join President Bush's re-election campaign in 2003. And for a year, I worked on the presidential election campaign, and just before the campaign was over, I received a White House appointment and worked in the White House for George W. Bush, and 2 years later was offered a position on the exploratory committee of Rudy Giuliani. Now, during the course of the Bush presidency, I noticed anecdotally at first, but then you couldn't help but notice the polling information and data, that the Republican Party lost the youth vote. Now, youth's political views are often formed by in reaction to the failures that they see in government. They haven't been around as long, so the failures that they witness deeply inform their own political behavior. And much in the way that I think Ronald Reagan brought an entire generation into the Republican Revolution and the Republican Party, I think they were propelled just as much by the failures of the Carter administration as they were by the soaring oratory and the vision that Ronald Reagan laid out. And I think this is what happened in 2008. Youth really broke for the first time from the Republican Party in 2004. They believed what John Kerry said, that the Iraq War was the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time. And I think that and the blunders in the Iraq War, on top of the failures of the federal response of Hurricane Katrina, the ethics and sex scandals on Capitol Hill in 2006, all of this, I think, combined sort of contributed to a Republican brand damage that was then met by a new face in politics who promised things that channeled the ethos of this generation. We all know that Barack Obama said, he espoused this desire to rise above partisanship, this appeal to service, this appeal to be part of something larger than themselves, and a resolve to make a government that works again. And this spoke brilliantly to the ethos of this millennial generation. My book is about understanding who the millennials are, what makes them tick, what their sensibilities are, how they approach these issues. And it's intended to serve as a roadmap for whoever the GOP candidate is, so that we can figure out how to connect and engage this generation before we lose them for the rest of their lives. So what I do is I take issues that millennials say they care most about: the economy, debt, deficits, the environment, education, immigration, and I talk about the sensibilities and what the polling tells us about those issues and this generation. And then I offer solutions for how the Republican nominee, or Republicans in general, can talk to millennials about those issues. So what I'll do is I'll just tell you a few things about millennials so you have a sense of them. And then we can discuss the peculiarities of each issue area, maybe with Elizabeth in the Q&A. The first thing you need to know about millennials, especially if you're a Republican, they have a very positive view of government. Republicans, as you all know, Republicans talk about limited government, less government interference in private lives. That part's fine, but the Reagan notion that government is the problem simply doesn't resonate with the millennials. In fact, they believe that if government isn't working, the people who are running government are the problem, and they need to get out and we need to get people in who can run the government well. But they simply just don't believe that government is problematic or that government is an impetus to progress in our society. Second, their politics are pragmatic, not ideological. This is the 9/11 generation. When 9/11 struck, they saw the president and the country put aside partisan interest and focus on what needed to be done. They tune out ideological talking points, and they focus on progress and pragmatic actions. So any candidate who wants to connect to them can't indemnify or vilify the person they're running against, especially if it's Barack Obama, because, by the way, the approval ratings of Barack Obama in this generation have dropped 18 percentage points since January of 2009, but they're still at 55%. So if you go after Barack Obama, you're just going to tune them out. They're not going to listen. You have to have pragmatic policy solutions and a pragmatic approach to explaining why your ideas are better. Simply demonizing the other guy doesn't work with this generation. Incidentally, 40% of themselves self-identify as moderate when you ask them about their ideology. 40% moderate, 29% liberal, 28% conservative. So again, another data point that informs this notion that they're pragmatists, not ideologues. The last point is that when it comes to social issues, millennials are the least traditional generation in American history. They're also the most diverse. They're 40% non-white. They have been raised with the least traditional family structure. More have been raised with single-parent households. They adhere least to traditional gender roles. The typical male breadwinner, female caretaker is just not a model that is overwhelmingly prevalent in this generation compared to previous generations. They're the least religious generation in American history. Only a quarter of them identify with organized religion. However, Reader's Digest conducted a poll 2 years ago, and 67% of them said they pray every day. So while they're not identifying with organized religion, they may be what some people call spiritual. Also, they have the fewest hang-ups about sexual orientation of any generation before them. So simply planting your flag in the sand and supporting and not supporting equal freedoms for gay and lesbian Americans is something that just doesn't resonate with this generation. So the book is about, given that as a template, how do we connect with them on issues like immigration, the environment, social issues, education reform, spending, debts and deficits, American exceptionalism. This is the first generation in American history that doesn't believe in American exceptionalism. So I talk about all these things. And as I was beginning to think about, how do I connect the dots? I'm a proud Republican. I'm a fiscal conservative. I think I'm pretty representative of my generation, maybe a little bit more to the right. How do we connect the dots with a group that approaches politics this way? And surprisingly, I found that Herbert Hoover had a perfect template for this 80 years before the first millennials were born. His approach to politics was pragmatic, not ideological. He believed that government could work. He spent his entire 8 years as Commerce Secretary. While he understood very clearly and had a very defined philosophy about the role of the individual and the role of government, and he believed that the government shouldn't interfere in the lives of individuals, he also believed that government could be helpful. And this was demonstrated, for example, in his really standardizing of the modern economy. You know, many folks don't know that the reason bricks are all come in standard sizes, or sheets for beds come as twin sizes and queens and kings and fulls, or the reason tires for automobiles are all the same sizes, or eggs come in half dozens and dozens. All of this is because Hoover, as Commerce Secretary, realized that the government could help streamline and make more efficient the modern economy. And he sat down. He didn't do this by fiat or legislative action. He worked with the private sector to figure out what would be best for them, and then they made standards. And these standards made the modern economy more productive, more efficient, brought prices down, and allowed American consumers to have access to more goods for lower prices. So he believed there was an active role the government could have, and that it was government's job to do certain things that the private sector or individuals couldn't do. This is absolutely synonymous with the millennial generation. And in addition to this, Hoover dedicated his life to public service. And the millennials of every generation, they volunteer more than any generation before them. They want to be part of something larger than themselves. In this sense, his values are very synonymous with the millennial generation. And that, he was a technologist. This generation has been raised with the internet. It has transformed the way their experience in American life has been in academics, their social life. Every part of life is informed by the fact that we are in a new age, an information technology age. And Hoover himself harnessed technology very early on. He pioneered many new technologies in mining. He was the only president who was an engineer. He was the first person to appear on television. First person, decided that this was a new technology we needed to figure out more about, put research and development into it, and look, it became, as we all know, one of the most powerful commercial tools, thanks to his vision and facilitation of the development of the television. And he was a globalist. This is the most global generation in American history, thanks to the internet and thanks to the fact that we're past the Cold War and in a new age of globalization. Millennials they have friends on Facebook and Twitter. They follow people all over the world. We can watch the riots in Tahrir Square in Cairo based on a Google executive who's tweeting from Tahrir Square. I mean, this stuff never happened before, but Hoover in his own right was a globalist 100 years before this. He was an international businessman. He had circumnavigated the globe 5 times by steamship before the advent of aviation. And so as a technologist, as a globalist, as somebody who dedicated his life to public service, and somebody who believed that government could be made to work, he channels the ethos of the millennial generation and provides a template in his book, American Individualism, for how the Republican Party, I think, can reach out and connect to the millennial generation. So with that, I will visit with Elizabeth and take your questions and take her questions and tell you more about any of these issues. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. I hope you can see, and I think I made Margaret happy when she saw her book that's marked up.
The most flattering thing for an author is to have, multicolored flags going throughout the book.
And
That's
highlighting.
incredible.
You forgot the
Oh,
highlighting.
I didn't even see the highlighting
I know, it's
before.
really,
That's incredible.
Anyway, I highly commend it. I know I saw a bunch of you all out there buying this, and I think it's a terrific read. So
And
great
as
job.
Bill O'Reilly always says, you buy it, I'll sign it.
Exactly. Or I bet you could even mail her a book plate if you didn't want to mail her the whole book.
You can mail me the book and I'll pay for postage. I'll send it back to you.
I want to start with just a few more things about your grandfather, and then I want to move back into the millennial discussion, because I just thought that was so interesting. One of the most controversial statements you made in your book has to be this one, and I quote, "I believe that the most effective defense of Hoover is not just that he did better than anyone else could have, but that his successor did no better." Please expand on why you think President Roosevelt really did no better than President Hoover in healing the economy.
Sure. Well, I'll reference a few other books. Amity Shlaes has written a wonderful book called The Forgotten Man. And also Bert Folsom has written a book called New Deal, Raw Deal. And both of these works, I think, contribute to the understanding of the New Deal and what it did do and what it didn't do. What we know now, as we review economics, is that while the New Deal did an enormous amount to help people feel better and put people back to work on some level, it actually didn't improve unemployment, and the economy didn't get better. In 1936 and 1937, the economy bottomed out to levels below the early 1930s levels. It's the lowest levels in that decade. And so, there was this wonderful, really not wonderful actually, famous quote by Henry Morgenthau, the Treasury Secretary under FDR, that, he was confiding with FDR in a closed session, and they were saying, it's just not working. We're trying everything. Amity Shlaes actually likens it to throwing things against the wall to see what would stick, and nothing was sticking. So, unfortunately, the New York Times even in 1930 said Herbert Hoover had handled the crisis and the stock market crash so deftly that nobody before him would have done as much, and very few of his predecessors he could have done nearly as well as he had done and performed under those pressures. So, and I think the proof is in the pudding. While the New Deal, again, made people feel better, and it was certainly politically very popular, it didn't fix the economy.
Which I think brings us to the subject of narrative. Margaret used that word when we were talking earlier. There is a strong narrative, and I've even heard candidates saying, my narrative is more compelling than my opponent's narrative. And I'm starting to find the word so appalling because, it's kind of like, it's the story. It becomes even, you referred to the mythology that the conservagentia have about the Republican Party now. So I thought it might be interesting from your perch at Fox. Talk to us about narrative. How has this become the driving force of what our candidates talk about?
Well, and look, American life and really life of all societies is about storytelling. And what story resonates the most with people that people can buy and believe in. And, the story and the narrative of the New Deal was very good. And that's one thing that Roosevelt was much better at than Hoover. Hoover was not raised in the politics of patronage. He was a very shy man. He was orphaned when he was 9 years old, and among the people who were close to him, he inspired deep loyalty. They called him the Chief. This was his sort of inner circle nickname. But he was as one columnist put it, what did they say? He burned in big crowds, he burned with a dim light. In other words, he wasn't, in small crowds he could light up the room, but in big crowds, like Roosevelt, Roosevelt was like Bill Clinton. He just lit up the room, everybody wanted to be around, gregarious. Hoover didn't have those set of personal skills, and so he couldn't get on the radio and use radio, ironically, this technology that he had really pioneered. He couldn't use it for the sake of his own political support to build loyalty, and he also just didn't believe in doing that. So FDR was much better at that. But again, I just think the importance in politics of telling a story that people can believe in is what makes you successful or not.
It's clear, and telling a story over and over again in the same way has certainly become the way of modern politics. It's really interesting to see that. I would love, before we get to these young people, my daughter being one of them, because I think you just nailed the way that millennials feel, is that you write that the Republican Party is currently a party of tribes, which I found so interesting. And you write about paleocons and neocons, SoCons, crunchy cons, and many cons in between. And I just thought our audience who've just bought the book might appreciate knowing a little more about the tribes.
So it's the second chapter is called Conservative Tribalism, and it's meant in jest because the conservative movement has evolved since the modern American conservative movement. When I say the conservative movement beginning with Edmund Burke, I mean that's another thing, but really the modern American conservative movement began in reaction to the New Deal. And with the formation of William F. Buckley's National Review, he brought together really the three first tribes, as I call them, but factions of conservatism. And they were, at the time, this is in the 1950s coalition, they were anti-communists, they were economic libertarians, and they were traditionalists. And then over time, neoconservatism joined the coalition, and the Protestant evangelical right joined the coalition after leaving Jimmy Carter and joining during what was the successful combination of Reagan's presidency, which was this new consortium of a conservative movement. But it's really important, I think, to remember that the conservative movement is not monolithic. There are a lot of different players in the conservative movement, and I think now the problem is millennials think conservatism means social conservatism, and they forget about fiscal conservatism or economic libertarians or neoconservatism, and that really there are all these different players in the conservative movement, and that it's far more diverse than simply being a monolithic voice for social conservative values.
Well, and I think we're seeing the Republican candidates that have come to the circle thus far are certainly moving to the right, much further right than what you would advocate the party does, I
the
think.
primary
but it's a social right.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, the primary process in this country, and we see this in the Democratic Party as well, but the primary process in the country appeals to the special interest in both parties, and the social conservatives have a disproportionately, in my view, larger emphasis in the primary process, just as certain groups in the left, the Democratic Party, maybe unions, have a disproportionate voice when it comes to selecting candidates as well. So that, I think, is something that is hard for millennials to square, quite frankly, because they see conservatism as social conservatism, and it just doesn't appeal to the way they see the world.
My daughter was born in 1987, and virtually everything you write, I thought, gee, have you been talking to Alex? It's just amazing. She has some more statistics about how they have more tattoos than any people in the United States.
This is amazing. 40% of millennials. So if your son or daughter or grandchild has a tattoo, it's okay.
They're normal.
Maybe it's not okay by you, but 40% of them have tattoos. And by the way, of that 40%, another 20% have more than one.
It's just different.
They are, can I just say one more thing about tattoos?
Please.
The majority of them, for the record, are hidden. So they're still discreet in their...
They put them somewhere their grandmother can't see them with the wedding dress. Yeah, that's important. They are also, I think it was fascinating that you wrote about their attitude, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how you feel, more specifically, you touched on it, on the issue of gay marriage, reproductive rights, some of the issues that I think must cause silence to fall on the room when you're speaking to some of your Republican audiences. But you certainly would tend to agree more with the millennials on those.
Well, so the millennials actually, when it comes to the culture wars of the 90s and the 80s and the 70s, this notion about really abortion riling people to the polls, the millennials have arrived in an organic consensus about that issue. And it is that abortion is morally unethical. They don't support it. They're not in favor of it. They don't want it for themselves or their friends. But they're not in favor of overturning Roe v. Wade. And they also are just not riled up by the issue the way the feminist movement in the 70s was, or the culture wars in the 80s were. So I say that they've arrived in organic consensus, and I just think that they just don't want to litigate it. Just status quo, keep it as it is. However,
these are not morally equivalent positions, gay rights and abortion. This is a generation where they're the only generation in American history where way more than half of them, for several years now, have been in favor of same-sex marriage. They have gay friends. They want their gay friends to have the same freedoms that they have. And this is something that I think is quite consistent with the tradition of the Republican Party. The Republican Party is the party of individual freedom. The Republican Party is the party, remember, we began as the party of abolition. This is the party that wanted to free the slaves. This is the party when suffrage movement started getting steam, they were part of the Republican Party. I mean, Susan B. Anthony, when she cast her ballot illegally in 1872, was proud to have cast a straight Republican ticket. So I think that being in favor of gay freedom is something that's consistent with the history of the party. And I live in New York, and it was New York Republicans who actually helped pass this legislative bill that, as your governor, Rick Perry, said, let them do what they want to do in New York. We're going to do what we do in Texas. And that's fine with me. But I would like to see a little bit of possibility for diversity on those issues. And with that said, I will say that this is not an issue that people aren't single-issue voters, and social issues, while it tends to be a line that gets more attention in the book, really, it's not something that is, the millennials are not in favor of damaging gay freedoms, but they also, there's a lot of other issues that they vote on. That's one of many, so that's not gonna, I would hope the Republican Party will eventually embrace freedom, but it's not, it's one of many issues that the Republican Party needs.
I couldn't agree more. I don't think there was a litmus test in '08. I think what they voted then was hope. That yes, we can, really resonated with them. And I think that's what's interesting about what you write about harking back to days in the Republican Party where the focus really was on the economy, on jobs, on individualism, American exceptionalism. I've heard that phrase more frequently, I don't know about y'all, than I had in a long time. You might talk a little bit about American exceptionalism and what that means.
I will. Can I just, on one other thing on the gay rights thing?
Please.
I would just say, this is an issue too. Barack Obama's not in favor of either. It's probably the only issue where Dick Cheney, and nobody would question Vice President Cheney's conservative values, is in favor of gay marriage. So I think that's one thing the Republican Party needs to keep in mind, that there are some shifts going on, and that it's okay. Like, it's okay to have a diversity of views on that issue within the conservative coalition. American exceptionalism, shockingly, this is the first generation in American history that doesn't believe that America is exceptional. And they don't actually understand the concept of American exceptionalism, but I think that's our fault because we haven't made the case to them. And what they hear when they hear American exceptionalism is they think that it means that Americans themselves, the people in America, are better than other people in the world. And because this is the most global generation, and they have friends that they follow on Twitter in Egypt and in South America and in Asia, they think, well, we're all exceptional, right? This is also the trophy participation generation. This is the kids who showed up and played and got a trophy, regardless of whether they won or not. So, they think everybody's exceptional. What's more exceptional about me than the other guys? And what hasn't been explained to them is that American exceptionalism isn't about me being better than somebody who was raised in France or somebody who was raised in Belgium or China or Bolivia. It's about the system in America. They think it's an expression of jingoism, but it's not. What we need to do a better job explaining is that it's the system that we have here and the way that the system has protected our liberties that allows Americans to become more because we have more freedoms and we can become our best selves more than in countries where there isn't this social mobility or economic mobility or the freedoms aren't protected in the same ways. And it's the system that is exceptional, not necessarily the individuals, but because the system is exceptional, it allows for individuals to become more. And that's the distinction that I think we've missed in connecting to the next generation. But it just simply means we need a better ambassador for it. We need somebody who can explain it and articulate it.
Maybe that's you. I think, the whole notion of harking back as well to the notion of American individualism and protecting the rights of the individual and how important that always was to the Republican Party. You write about that, and I think that is an interesting thread that can be pulled through to 2011, 2012 for this younger generation.
Absolutely.
Really talking about individuals again.
Absolutely. It's about individuals in an individual-centered society. But the idea of American individualism, it's the notion of rugged individualism, which was a campaign speech that Herbert Hoover gave in 1928, which was a distillation of the values of American individualism in the book he wrote 6 years prior to that. And it's the notion of an individually centered society, but one that is grounded in a sense of responsibility for community and for the people around them. And that is something that absolutely appeals to the millennial generation because they want to be connected to others, they want to be part of something larger than themselves, but they understand that they choose their own life course. A society that focuses around each individual to make the best choices for themselves is one that is most productive. So that's the model of American individualism. It's rugged individualism imbued with a community spirit.
That's great. You have, as if you haven't touched on quite enough hot button subjects, in your book you spend a lot of time talking about immigration and immigration reform. Talk to us a little bit about that and how does that mesh with what the millennials might think?
Okay, so the reason this issue is important for the millennial generation is because they are the most diverse generation in American history. They're 40% non-white, and the largest minority group are Hispanic. And it's very easy for the Republican Party to be painted as the anti-immigrant party and the sort of anti-Hispanic party because of our very strong stance on border security and controlling the borders. But when you ask millennials, do you think a country needs to secure its borders? Do you think that's something that it has to do? 59% of them say yes, absolutely. Now, I've become a huge pragmatist on this issue because I worked for George W. Bush in the Bush administration when he tried to get significant national immigration reform passed through the Congress. And it, as we all know, failed miserably. But what's happened in the time since then is the issue has become so polarized that Democrats can't even get the most minor reforms through. The DREAM Act, which is the act that would allow the children of illegal immigrants who have come here illegally through no fault of their own, who serve in the armed services or graduate from high school, to then get onto the path of having a green card. Harry Reid could not get that through a Democratic lame duck session in 2010. If Harry Reid couldn't get it through a Democratic lame duck session when he had the Senate under his thumb, that means the issue has become so polarized that not Democrats or Republicans will be able to do anything on this issue until significant and serious defined benchmarks are met on border security. And I think the Republican Party has new faces who can help explain this in a way that will avoid us being characterized as a party of anti-Hispanic or anti-immigration or anti. Marco Rubio is a wonderful new voice in the Republican Party, but we also have two new Hispanic Republican governors of border states, Brian Sandoval in Nevada and Susana Martinez in New Mexico. And I think we just need to make our case. I think articulating that, it's about legal immigration, and the only way we're going to get to the place where we can have significant, real immigration reform is if we first hit significant benchmarks on border security.
Fascinating issue, and obviously one we could continue to talk about, but I think it might also be interesting to just broad brush the environmental regulation issue that you bring up and environmental activism.
Yeah.
And talk about that with us.
I mean, I say that the Republican Party needs to make a strong case for conservative environmentalism. I mean, youth care a lot about the environment. They've grown up sort of hearing about the environment, and this is a good thing. And the Republican Party, by the way, has an incredible tradition in the environmentalist movement here. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt started the environmentalist movement in the United States. Richard Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency. I think that the Republican Party needs, rather than just being cast as a lot of the reason we get cast as being anti-immigrant or anti-whatever, anti-environment is because we haven't put forth an alternative proactive agenda. And so I think we have an enormous opportunity in 2012 to put forth an agenda for conservative environmentalism. common sense conservation makes sense. You know, I think we can talk about climate change without being as alarmist as the left is. And I think that we can talk about how to create an energy independent future without relying on the government to deliver it for us, that there are public-private partnerships that can happen. There's conservative principles and pro-market principles that can inform what would be a conservative environmentalist agenda.
And you think that would resonate with millennials?
Absolutely. This is one of the issues that uniformly ranks in the top 5 of issues they care about.
It absolutely does. It's why green everything sells
Yep.
nowadays, and they care about it. Another little minor issue that Margaret brings up in her book is Islamist supremacy. And you know, you might just talk with us about that. Give us a little preview of your thoughts on that.
Well, I think it's really important for this next generation to, and all of us Americans, to be reminded what we're doing overseas and why we're in Afghanistan and what some of the challenges are in the Middle East. And remember who the faces and who the people that struck us on 9/11 are. And I think we've forgotten because we called it the war on terror. We didn't really name our enemies. We didn't talk about this radical political ideology disguised as a religion that actually decided that America was its mortal enemy. And the reason I call it Islamist supremacy is because it's really a supremacy movement. It's not about a religion. It's a political supremacy movement. And I think supremacy movements, the youth are being taught in schools, their curriculums, they have Nazi supremacy curriculums. They have white supremacy curriculums. They know what a political supremacy movement is. They get that it's extremist and unacceptable and you know, not just dangerous for society. There's a reckoning point there where you have to push back. And so by talking about this global, you know, the war on terror, which now the Obama administration has been calling overseas contingency operations. I mean, it's so oblique, and it's so, I mean, you have to put a name to it so you know what we're doing and why we're in Afghanistan and why we've lost. I mean, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, there is a very good reason we were there pushing back after 9/11. And I think you have to name it and you have to call it like it is. And I think because they understand supremacy movements, it's by the way, I don't say Islam supremacy, it's Islamist supremacy, because this is an ideology, not a religion. And it's a political ideology that is fatal, that absolutely has decided that America is its mortal enemy, and we have no choice but to push back.
Education reform, where would you think the millennials would want us to go with that?
It's interesting. The other issue that always ranks highly for millennials is education. They get that the education system is broken in America. 30% of millennials aren't graduating from high school. The overwhelming majority of that 30% are African American or Hispanic. The privileged millennials see that there's a problem with the system, and it is the millennial generation that has flooded to the charter school movement, Teach for America movement. There are myriad movements that are teaching at inner city schools because they get that there's a problem, they want to be part of the solution. And Teach for America is flooded by millennials who want to be part of the solution. And I think, I mean, what's really compelling is that the strongest reforms that are happening in education are happening in states with Republican governors and Republican legislators. LIFO reform, last in, first out, teacher tenure, and collective bargaining. All of these are happening in states where Chris Christie in New Jersey, Rick Snyder in Michigan, Rick Scott in Florida, Bill Haslam in Tennessee. All these governors are seriously taking on education reform, and they're doing it because their hands are not tied by the teachers' unions. And I think that that's the simple truth. It's a hard truth, and I say it cautiously to a crowd of LBJ Democrats. But unfortunately, I think even Democrats have started to realize that, unfortunately, the teachers' unions' interests seem to be looking out for teachers more than students. And anytime you have this lobby has more money in politics than any other special interest lobby, more than the NRA, more than Big Pharma, more than the SEIU, more than any other lobby in politics the teachers' unions have. So I think that that's actually something where they're already there. We just need to connect the dots for millennials.
Well, and I would pose that the millennial generation is probably the most tested generation of any generation thus far.
Yeah.
When they're having teaks and tacks and et cetera, whatever they call it in New York. And yet they do see that their curriculum has become boring and tedious, and the bright ones come home and say, my daughter came home with The Great Gatsby and said, Mom, do I really have to read this? And I said, oh, honey, it's one of the best books ever written. And she said, well, I have to read it chapter by chapter and then stop and journal it and then highlight it. And I said, oh, honey, just read the book straight through. Come back. If teacher wants you to do that, do it. But
you need
they
good
see
teachers,
it.
and
But
that's
they see it.
Yeah, they see that there's really a paucity of good. There are great teachers out there. There are amazing teachers. But what happens is, Michelle Rhee has this fabulous statistic where if you just took the bottom 5% of bad teachers and replaced them with medium teachers, the United States would suddenly catapult to being first in the world in reading. What CEO wouldn't do that?
Seems
None.
pretty simple.
Yeah.
It does. I think we've got time for one more question. So many of us here, so many folks sitting out there worked for President Johnson, and then some have, like in my case, have parents that worked for President Johnson. So we certainly understand trying to PR for a president that, whose narrative kind of went one direction when all of us know that there was a whole rich story over here of accomplishment that just hasn't been captured. And I think in both of our presidents' case, it's changing.
Yeah.
But I thought you might just want to end up with kind of how, if you could wave a magic wand, how would you like American school children to think about President Herbert Hoover?
I would like them to know that he was a great humanitarian who put people ahead of politics, who was the founder of the modern NGO, who was considered a master of emergencies by his contemporaries, and who did everything he could during the Great Depression to right the ship of state, and that it was an economic calamity larger than any person at the time, but that he was probably the most skilled person at the time to be there. And a life of extraordinary accomplishment of 90 years should not be obscured by 4 years that became a partisan and a political and highly personalized historiography. And that there is, as one of my relatives always said, this is the 4 years of his presidency, and this is the 90 years of his life. And I would like them to understand Hoover in the context of his broader accomplishments rather than just by the legacy of the Great Depression.
Well, I think for all of you, this book will go a long way toward helping that. Thank you so much
Thank you,
for being
Elizabeth.
here with us. This has been great.
Thank you very much.